Okay guys, welcome back to the channel. Repping my new sunglasses from West Hollywood visit a couple weeks ago. But more importantly, what I did in West Hollywood a couple weeks ago was visit Andrew Jones' studio for the second time. And I was able to hear the Sourcepoint 888 in his studio. If you recall, I actually visited him a year ago as well. And that was to hear the Sourcepoint 8s and the Sourcepoint 10s. And I did it with Steve McCormick. That was a fabulous visit. Great series. If you haven't watched that, I encourage you to watch that one. I'll put up a little link if you want to watch that to catch up on the first visit. But it was great going back, and I want to thank him. Number one, he spent that whole weekend. You saw my video from Costa Mesa, a whole hour-long presentation he gave. And he was doing that over and over and over in Costa Mesa. And then I hit him up after the show 2 days later. He was more than gracious to have me, and actually one of my members joined me. One of the perks of being a member, Michael was able to join me as well, and we got to hear the 888s in his studio where they were voiced and hear a little bit more about the design and ask him some one-on-one questions that are much tougher for me to do at shows. Certainly you never hear the potential of the gear in those showrooms. So this is a chance for you to hear from Andrew directly in his studio, see some things that are really cool, talk about the design, and then in a second video, I'm going to release the music clips separately so you can hear the 888s in his studio. And spoiler alert, phenomenal, under $10,000. Now that's a knee-jerk. It's only $5,000. Amazing. And you'll even hear Michael say at one point, one of the questions he asked is, I don't know if it's in the music clip video. I think it's in the music clip video that I'll release separately. He's like, what do people want more when they spend cost no object? And of course, there's always ways you can improve things, but the law of diminishing returns is hit almost immediately with this new Sourcepoint 888. And one of the cool takeaways, same thing he said, excuse me, in that hour-long presentation in Costa Mesa, which was music to my ears, especially from a legend speaker designer, that, as you know, I've been a long time promoter of active crossovers, you know, among other things, DSP and all this versus parts, solder, all this kind of stuff that I think is just antiquated based on what we have now. Well, he pretty much admits that he would do more active crossovers, and we're seeing it in the high-end industry, and he'll talk about that in the video. It's super high-end, which is a good sign. But he's tried it in the past, and he agrees that it's a superior approach. They just don't sell. So you have to do an economics equation here. But one thing that you're going to hear him talk about, I just want to point this out to notate, because it's music to my ears and good to hear from a legend versus always just hearing from me. He actually started designing the 888s using an active crossover because he wanted to see what the highest potential was. And then he retrofits things with passive parts because currently that's what people want. They want their own separate amps and all this kind of stuff. And that's what sells more based on experience. So, and he does a great job of delivering close to the same performance. But there's still, as he talks about, you can get a flat frequency response, but sometimes that comes at a cost of problems in the impedance curve. Anytime you're adding parts and just doing part swapping and using, you know, these passive parts, that's just not anymore, in my opinion, the way to get the most optimal results. Although you can get exceptional results, and that is exactly what Andrew Jones did with this Sourcepoint 888. And you can't get any more pedigree and experience than he does, because not only does he have the pedigree of many years experience, if once you learn the facilities he's worked in, how much you cannot replace, even if you have Clipple or whatever, you cannot replace the hundreds of speakers he's designed, doing it 8 hours a day or more for decades, because all these measurements have value. I'm a big fan of measurements, and the Clipple as well. All those have some value. Not as good as in-ear at the listening position like the Bach, but I'm not going to get off on that tangent. All of them have value, but one thing that I think Andrew will confirm is that they still do not give you far field measurements like the Bach. You need to infer some things, and whether it's the Clipple or a mic 1 foot away on axis, there's still things you have to infer and aren't perfect. A ported speaker in the rear versus in the front, these same type of measurement techniques don't work. A Maggie, an open baffle, a dipole, measuring it the same way as a sealed box or ported box. There's so many variables that Andrew has that others don't have. That's the thing that I can share with you behind the scenes without disclosing his, proprietary techniques that you really don't understand. And I want you to understand it's so much more complex than just looking at a graph, or 2 graphs or even 3. It's so much more involved. And that's what I appreciate and love going visit him, because I always learn how much really entails. Everybody wants to be a speaker designer, thinks they're a speaker designer, think they can do better. Look, it's very hard to beat the pedigree of Andrew Jones, whether it's speaker sales, who he's worked for, how much he gets paid, any metric you want to use. The decades of experience are hard to replace. And so in his hands, you're in good hands. Trust me on that. And I think the 888's under $10,000, at $5,000, there's only 2 speakers I think of offhand. That one and the Dolly, if you like a box speaker design, knee-jerk, easy buy. And actually one of my members has already got the 888s, giving it major thumbs up. So hopefully you'll find this helpful, and this video tour of his studio, which also showcases some other really cool things. Watch my other tour as well if you want even more details, and I'll see you back here soon. Yeah, we're in, you remember Michael.
The stuff I hadn't even thought to bring to the show.
Oh, wow, look at that.
This is a very rare piece. You'll never see this. It's an Orpheus preamp. And this dates back to when? The 70s?
Early 70s.
Yeah, it's got that 70s vibe. And then the connections are back here. Oh, I don't know.
Oh no, it's just those rolling back.
Oh, okay.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And all
Pioneer. Got your name on
What
it.
does that?
For the room,
Oh,
I
because
guess.
it was shipping. So yeah, I must have
Used it in a room.
When did I use it in a? That's interesting.
Wow. Now we gotta have to go back to show coverage and see.
But yeah, it was a really cool.
That's
concept.
very cool. Yeah. So you literally did have to move the volumes on both at the same.
Yeah,
They did not sync.
that's not actually very
Handy today.
handy today.
No. Really cool though.
And these slots, it's really. Let's see if I can do this.
I was going to say, how are they connecting the cabling?
So it comes out?
It comes out. I can't do it.
Really?
But it's on. Like these broom hand. When you clip a broom onto something, or you're clipping on something onto a bike frame.
Like
it's those.
A peg with like a little.
So there's a
like
peg out the side of that, and then there's a clip shaped
Yeah.
like that. It's those that it uses.
That's brilliant. Somebody should do something similar today. You could do it modern style,
I think somewhere I still have the power amp section, but it's lost the Nextel side panels, so I'd have to remake those. But the power amps were often blowing up. They weren't the most stable.
Yeah, for everybody watching, we're in Andrew Jones' studio. I've featured this place before. Watch my other videos. I'll link them to get a walkthrough. But what I wanted to do is showcase for everybody the 888s, which I haven't had a formal demo and presentation on. They've been so packed, the room at Expona. I do have an hour-long video of Andrew at the Home Entertainment Show where he showcased the speakers that influenced him first in the hobby, as well as ones he's designed. And you get to not only hear him talk about it, but also hear them. That was a super special treat. I've never had that kind of treat at a show. But he was gracious enough to let Michael and I come here and hear the 888s in his studio, which is great. In fact, I met Michael Friedman. He said he's been out here. He lives right across from the Sunset Marquee where we've been. Great guy. And so, Andrew, you want to walk us through what's new with the 888 as if I've never heard of them yet? I know the 8s and the 10s very well.
Just excuse me wearing my suit.
Yes.
So, 888's obviously the development of the Sourcepoint 8. We went from the 10 to the 8 because although the 10 was deliberately a big speaker, people would come in and go, "Oh, I didn't think it was that big.
Yeah, exactly. That's what Michael
Well,
just said.
it's a
Yeah.
10 inch. Yeah, how small can a 10 inch be? So we did the 8. My concern was, since the 10 was a two-way, and I agreed to do a two-way concentric driver because, you know, I don't want too much movement around the tweeter from the cone acting as a waveguide. And in a three-way, you don't get any as soon as you exclude the bass from it. But if I'm doing a 10 inch, maybe I got the possibility also, because it doesn't move that much most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, do a two-way. Now do the 8 inch. Well, it's going to move more. So the trick there was not let it go so low and make sure it doesn't unload below the port tuning frequency, so it's not using up useless excursion. And so in practice, it doesn't move any further than the 10 inch. And therefore, it's a viable thing. But it's got less bass, so we've gone from pretty good bass from the 10 down to not as good bass for the 8, which is an acceptable compromise in a smaller speaker and lower cost. Now let's get the bass back. Let's do the floor standard, because an obvious thing to do, having done 2 speakers that are stand mounts, is to do a floor standard.
Right.
And so the 888, and the name should be pretty obvious.
Yes.
It's 888.
Yes.
8.
Simple.
So turn it into a 3-way system.
Mm-hmm.
I toyed with the idea of just having all 3 running, but I thought, no, let's make it go back to a dedicated 3-way. And so this is literally the driver from the 888, from the 8, and put into a sub enclosure inside this cabinet, and crossed over around 130 hertz. And then these are 2 new dedicated bass drivers. And I decided to do a throwback to when I was doing the TAD speakers, which all the bass drivers are short coil in a long gap, so underhung, which is always more linear than overhung. The idea of how linear is it, how far can it move and be linear? You normally take the difference between the length of the coil and the length of the magnetic field. And so as long as it's moving within that, it's linear. Well, it's not actually, because the force is not perfectly flat topped within that range that you call linear. It's always kind of a hump. Whereas in a short coil long gap, so I did coil gap. Okay, so let's do it that way. Short coil in a long gap. Both the field and the force will be perfectly linear within the constraints of until it gets to the edge of the gap.
Interesting. Okay.
And you can do further things to linearize it with dual opposing magnets, which I've done in these drivers. So it's a very linear bass driver. And it took a bit of development, and it's still expensive, but still this is quite a good value speaker at 5,000 a pair.
5,000, yeah.
And I also wanted to make sure that not only is that in its own enclosure, each bass driver is in its own separate enclosure.
Okay.
And part of that is when you've got a tall cabinet like this, the first standing wave is due to the height mode in the cabinet. So if it's all just one big space for the bass driver, that first mode can be at frequency where it's sort of too close for comfort to the crossover point, and then you have to, as soon as you start trying to absorb that, well, you're also affecting the efficiency of the vent operation. So it's a lot of messing about, let's say, to fix that. Whereas if you just cut the cabinet in half, you've moved the mode twice as high. So it's well out of the range, it's an octave higher. But I can't just, halfway is here, right?
Right.
If I divide it there, well then that bass unit's in a small chamber and this one's in a big one. So you have to zigzag with vertical bracing, you zigzag the chambers
To be equal.
throughout, so that the sum of all 3 chambers is equal.
Interesting.
So there's sort of in a chamber way, connected chambers, there's 6 of them for the bass driver. So
And then ported in the back.
and ported in the back. But all that zigzagging does give a very inert enclosure.
Yeah.
So, and then a vent for each chamber in the back, and a very expensive crossover. It's built on 2 boards, and one for the bass driver and one for the mid-range tweeter. So, 3 or 4 times the cost of the crossover that's in the Sourcepoint 8.
Okay.
Because passive crossovers, when you're crossing over at 130 hertz, are really difficult to do in terms of
The amount of
the
parts.
size of the components,
Yeah.
obviously the cost of them,
Right.
trying to compensate for driving into such an awkward impedance curve that a speaker has, and so you have to use these conjugation components. Always when you're optimizing, maybe you give yourself a target curve, and you just let the optimizer have at it, right?
Right.
And you see it pulling in closer and closer and closer, and it gets a perfect match of the passive crossover to the shape that you wanted.
Right.
You go, this is going really well.
Until you look at the impedance.
Let me look at the impedance.
Yeah.
And it's dropped down to about 0.3. Well, that's not viable.
Right.
So then you start nudging the impedance, and you get unhappier and unhappier, and then you're just trying to find out what is the best way
That's compromise.
of
Yeah.
getting this done. And
Which you said also you would do more active speakers where you have more control, certainly, if they sold.
if they sold, the very first prototype I built of this as a check the viability of doing this, because it was going to take. I thought, well, let me try designing a passive crossover, and it was just, this isn't working, and I need to listen to it to verify that I'm doing this. I thought, I'll build an active crossover and power the bass driver, but bring it in at speaker level, and at least see how the bass drivers sound and how the tuning sounds and everything. And that's just a few hours work to build up a little circuit and stick it inside an amplifier and do an active crossover for proof of concept.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew we weren't going to be releasing it in that form, but at least now I can check, have I got the right sensitivity levels between the bass and the mid-range,
Right.
and the right crossover points. So I could do all of that initial listening development work.
That's cool to learn about, yeah.
And then once I got that all sorted out, then try and mimic it with the passive crossover.
So that's cool. And you did do an active ELAC version.
Yeah, we had sort of what is the Unify 2.0 or reference,
But
also
basically an
became,
active one, yeah.
an active, fully active three-way speaker.
Right.
And I made it analog crossovers. It did have a wireless transmission option, so that you didn't have to plug it in.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a digital transmission channel.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I met the needs of analog diehards for that, so
Right.
that it didn't have DSP in, and I didn't find I needed DSP, especially with the concentric driver.
Yeah.
But great speaker, sounded great when I set it up for the show last weekend, but they never really sold
Yeah.
as we want. We keep trying.
More and more are going to it. I think it's becoming more accepted, but yeah, there's still some holdouts that are
Funny
fighting
enough,
it.
some of the ultra high end is going towards that more than the middle. Or
Yeah,
low.
YG is doing active versions. I just went to Gold Note. They have a totally active 90,000 per speaker.
Yeah.
Incredible. So yeah, there is, because it's hard to deny, especially with someone your pick, the advantages.
Yeah.
It's just a case of getting past some of the preconceived notions of the past. One other thing I wanted, this front baffle, even in the Sourcepoint 8s, is super thick.
Yeah, inch and a half.
Yeah. So even if you do the knuckle wrap test, this is where the most of the vibrations and where you want the
Enters,
strength.
and it's
Yeah.
very
And you've got it also angled for, I guess, diffraction purposes.
Diffraction, yes.
So this is at $5,000. You're getting the pedigree of Andrew Jones. If anybody heard those TADs, which are still among the best in the world, you were the one that designed their reference model. Still to this day, most people think that's one of the best speakers, especially box speakers in the world. A lot of that that pedigree is in this $5,000 speaker with really modern day crossover parts, cabinet material. I don't see where you're sacrificing much. You obviously have to set it for a price point of $5,000, but the proof will be in the listening. We're going to listen too, but the early reports have been outstanding. And if anybody has the 8s and wants to get that extra level of bass extension, how far does this one actually go down?
So, true anechoic, -6 at 32.
32, okay.
In this room, which I will prove to you, I'm getting pretty flat down to 20 hertz.
Okay.
And I don't quote those kind of specifications because there's no standardized way of doing comparisons. So all the published responses are the -6 dB point, the effectively anechoic. What you get in your room is you might be very lucky and get down much lower than that, but I can't count on that. So any speakers that are specified and they go 20 hertz in room, meaning what? So
right. Well, also measurements real quick. In our last video, we spent a little bit of time with Steve McCormick showing your measurement techniques, and you do a lot of things much more advanced than just simply taking the speaker outside, putting a mic a foot away, and then making changes and primitive, judgments based on that. This guy has much more sophisticated, even more so than Clipple, which can give you some estimates and some things, but you really need to have pedigree of experience and understanding and interpreting them, which a lot of people don't have. That's one of the takeaways I've had getting to know Andrew and hearing his designs, where it really pays off. There's a much more sophisticated way than just doing either Clipples or taking a measurement 1 foot away. In fact, in these speakers, they aren't even meant to be listened to on axis. Is that right?
I typically recommend no speaker to listen on axis. Just it's the point of maximum symmetry. So if you're going to have wiggles, diffraction responses, you'll get them on axis more than off axis.
Is that right? Okay.
Tweeters without a waveguide, right slap bang in the middle of equidistant, are going to be worst. Concentric drives are a bit better because it's set back and the wavefront's expanded to be larger before it reaches the edges. But they're still, because it's concentric and it's going to look concentric in the cabinet, it will have issues on axis.
Gotcha.
So typically by 5 to 10 degrees off axis, those have subsided, but the energy balance is still basically the same as on axis. If you go beyond that, then it's sort of, when you get a very good off-axis response that will, instead of doing this kind of thing, just gradually tilt down, it's almost like a tone control. You can adjust imaging and sidewall reflections by
towing in,
because again,
it's your quasi EQ. Yeah,
but it's also sort of like an EQ, and so very often with these, I just face them not straight down the room. That's too severe, but I face them to certainly focus.
Yeah, and you can see here we have a slight toe in for the listening. It's a beautiful, well-treated. These are all room treatments, and they're waved. I don't know if you can tell the curvature here. So
I wasn't drunk when I put them on.
No.
I did actually do that deliberately.
Yes, it's really cool. It sounded phenomenal with the 8s and 10s last time Steve McCormick and I were here. So we're going to spend a little time. Thank you again, Andrew, for letting us come by. We're going to listen to just a few songs, and I'll have that in a separate clip with all the music clips.
Right, my pleasure.